Hi there, and welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and joining me today is Meredith Hinds. Meredith, welcome.
Thank you so much, Will. I'm so happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. So, just to start us off, if you could just tell us who are you and what do you do, and really anything else you'd like to add about who you are.
My name is Meredith Hinds. I am a mother of 5 children. I'm also a writer. I'm a Catholic convert. I converted to the faith in 2016 with my husband. And I write saint content for children. I also write for adults, but a lot of the things that I write are faith-based. And I enjoy working on stories, and I enjoy kind of bringing things together in a way that might give somebody new perspective, children or adults. And one of the things that I am writing for is I'm writing for that moment when a parent is reading to their child. Like, that's a really important moment in my own house. And to think that anything that I do is facilitating that time in other houses is just, it's beyond my wildest dreams. So I'm so glad to be able to get to do it.
Fantastic. Well, and you do a great job with it. The book that we're discussing today, in large part, is Eucharistic Saints, 20 Stories of Devotion to Jesus. And this is a new title from Tan Books. And my son, who's almost 7, and I have been reading, we've read a couple of these now in preparation for this conversation, and he loved them. I loved them too. I mean, we taught, what did we read? We read one about St. Thomas Aquinas and another about the angel of peace who visited the children in Fatima, Portugal. And that was really neat. That was, of course, in that story, many of the listeners probably are familiar with it. The children receive communion, and a couple of them receive first communion from this angel who's sent by God. And my son, when we finished the story, looks at me and goes, "How do I do this? I want an angel to give me first communion." And I said, well, ask, I guess, pray about it. Before the show, you were saying, go out to the woods, find something.
Yes, go find some sheep and be in the woods.
Yeah, just be a shepherd, just get on that.
Shepherd, spend a lot of time alone with the Lord and in quiet, let him come to you. That's, it's interesting because as different as that situation might be from our life, what I hear in that story from your son is this real childlike longing for these things. And I think that that's a big part of why the Fatima children received what they received, is because they were children and they had that childlike longing. So what a beautiful thing for your son to say. I love that.
No, he's great. Just recently he asked me if he could get a brown scapular. And I said, well, there's stuff that you have to do. If you get it, you got to pray the rosary at least once a week, and you have to have a devotion to our Blessed Mother and understand that everything that's yours is hers. And he was just like, okay, sign me up. And so we asked our pastor. He's, like I said, he's currently 6. So I asked our pastor, can you enroll him? And he said, absolutely, let's go. And he's just been, the other day he asked for a Bible, like his own Bible. Like, this is not a normal 6-year-old, but I think it's hitting on, I'm thinking about it, and I was talking to my wife. I'm like, are we just doing a really good job with him, or is this just all grace? And I think it's probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
But it's, one thing I know that we have been doing, so if there's parents listening and they're like, man, my kid doesn't want anything to do with religion, I think books like this and having this time set aside every day where you're just touching on the faith, you're proposing it, you're informing your child about these things in a way that's manageable to them, something that they can take in, like a story, can be so powerful because it taps into that creative potential in them. But then also, they're like little sponges when it comes to grace. I mean, when I worked in a parish, we in the Diocese of Phoenix, we have restored order for the sacraments, and so confirmation and first communion happen in 3rd grade. And I had a lot of the parents who came from other places that do it in high school. They said, well, why 3rd grade? I mean, they're too young. I said, oh, well, no, they're not, actually.
Right.
They're more open to grace than you and I are most of the time. So I think there's this, I mean, you touched on it. There's this capacity of a childlike faith that, of course, our Lord tells us to emulate, right? To be like a child.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that restored order is an option here in the Diocese of Colorado Springs. They don't have everybody do it, but parents can choose to do it. And that's what we've chosen to do with our oldest. And I think it's interesting, to bring up that question, because I think it's an important question, but of somebody being too young, for something like this. And there's a story later on in the book about Pope Pius X. And he was the one who the age of First Communion had kind of, it had gone like up and up and up and up and up and up. And it was like, it was like 14 or 16 in some places. It was like, he was Pope in like the early 1900s, but really like late 1800s, there were places where you were quite old before you could receive First Communion. And that document, he wrote Quam Singulari, which talks about why he is lowering the age. And that's just, I think, a really good document for any parent to read. If like the question on their mind is, what is my child's capacity for faith? Like, what does this mean? I think that Pope Pius X has some really good words for all of us about, what it means to be ready for something, and what it means to have faith, and like children's absolutely extraordinary capacity to be really faithful, particularly, if they are, they're familiar with the faith, they're surrounded by these things, and like somebody has presented it to them in this really like loving and warm way. So yeah, that's
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of restored order. Also a great lover of the Eastern tradition of baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion for babies.
Yep, just get it done.
Because
Yeah,
it just shows how grace comes first. It's not that we are only so much more special as people, as human beings, because we have the faculty of reason, for example.
Yes.
And beyond that, it's that grace comes first when it comes to the sacramental life. Confirmation isn't just some sort of Catholic bar mitzvah or a rite of passage. It's the necessary completion of baptismal graces, as the Catechism says. So it's this receiving of the Holy Spirit and this empowering by the Holy Spirit to live out the faith. And so I'm so grateful for Pope Pius X putting the age of First Communion back around the age of 6 or 7 or 8, somewhere in there, the age of reason.
He says in Quam Singulari, I loved this. His phrasing was more or less 7. So he uses the words like more or less, right? And so he's like, really, this is about the child's age of reason,
right? And
you do, and I think as a parent, you do see that happen. And with my first child, I was kind of like, what are they talking about? And then it wasn't like he woke up one day and was like, oh, he is the age of reason now. But it was like this understanding that kind of came over him. It was like, okay, we are here. We are here at this age of reason. And this real desire for the Eucharist.
Yeah, no, I've seen that. We were talking before the show about the age of our oldest being around 7, more or less.
More
7.
or less 7, yes.
And it's I absolutely will echo that. I've seen that in my son, where he started asking for these things like the scapular, and he seems to just be much more clued in at Mass. Like he's paying attention more to the action of what's going on, not just what the people are doing, but the sacred action of Christ. Like he's seeing in the signs and symbols what's actually going on, which shows me that he's got a level of abstraction that he didn't have a year ago.
Right.
And I think that's really getting at that idea of the age of reason. How much of this sort of understanding of the age of reason came to bear as you were writing these? Because, I mean, as a writer myself, I find it incredibly hard to write for kids. It's just not a gift I have. And I don't know, how do you gauge what is appropriate without watering it down? And so that's part 1. Part 2 is like, what age are you aiming at?
With this collection in particular, this is gonna be a wide and kind of weird window. But between the ages of about 5 and 10,
Hmm.
and I think a 10-year-old, 9, 10-year-old could certainly read these stories for themselves. A 5-year-old would be able to sit through one. And I think for the reasons that we've been talking about, they might resonate more with a 7-year-old. But I sent this book to a lot of my friends, and I've heard really wonderful things about their 2 to 4-year-olds sitting there and looking at the pictures.
Hmm.
And there are some really beautiful pictorial representations of the Eucharist in here.
Yeah.
So, I'm like, it's for everyone. Anybody can read this. But what I try to do when I write for children is I try to focus in on a particular scene. So that's what each of these stories are. I think that we see a lot of saint content for children that's pretty biographical. And I think that's important and it's good. It's good that we have it. But it kind of starts with the saint's birth, talks about their childhood some, and then, their life and what they do, and then how they die. And these are really good and important things to know. And like a child can benefit tremendously from those kinds of things. But I mean, there are some things that we've read before about like to my little ones who are all 7 and under, but about the saints like building churches and schools. And my children don't quite resonate with those kinds of things necessarily. They're like, I don't understand why that's so important, particularly as people living in a suburban area where churches and schools are everywhere. They're like everywhere. They're like, okay, like they built churches, schools, and hospitals. And I'm like, there were not those things until they did that. So with this particular collection, I tried to focus in really on scenes. And I think that children respond to that. They respond to action happening. Like, we've got the story of Saint Tarcisius, and the action happens and at like the critical times and those kinds of. So I think that children really enjoy scenes. They enjoy details. They like the pictures that are there. They like things that inspire, questions. So you don't have to answer all of their questions necessarily within the story. Like it can be something that like inspires them to think. Like I'm thinking about your son's question about like, can I have the Eucharist that way? Like that kind of thing. Like, can my first communion be with angels? Like it inspires a question. So it can be something. Children can totally engage with something that doesn't like have all of like the answers. They like things that are a little bit strange even. So that's what
that's fantastic. And actually it's super helpful for me as well. I mean, I'm not I won't say that I'm going to go and write a children's story now, but I definitely love the idea of focusing on a scene.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure there's got to be some analogs even for older kids, teenagers, even young adults, where we don't need to feed or give everybody water with a fire hose. You can just give them a manageable scene, because stories are so important. I mean, stories are how we communicate on a fundamental level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, that's really helpful to understand.
Good. Yeah, I think that it can be a temptation to try to like, what if they only sit and listen for this time? So I have to get everything that is so important in like right now. And it's like, no, you actually, first of all, it's not all on you. God is gracious, and there will be other people like in your child's life who will come alongside them to teach them as well. But you can also just you can linger over something that is interesting to you in particular. I think that's really important for parents. Is my husband has this rule that he doesn't read anything to the children that he doesn't like. So like if there's a book that like he doesn't enjoy, he's like, I'm not reading this to you. I will read to you. Bring me one of these books, and that's what I'll read to you.
So, I that definitely resonates with me. That's also a policy I have.
Yes, no, I think it's a good policy. I think that it makes a lot of sense because
yeah. I mean, as a teacher, it's like when there's a subject that I have to cover because it's in the curriculum, I have to make myself excited about it if it's something that it's not my favorite.
Yeah.
But it's so much easier. There's like a real facility if I'm able to give them something that I enjoy. It's almost effortless.
Mhm.
Like you put the pieces in play in the preparation, but then you just kind of go for it. But as parents, as the primary educators of our children, we absolutely should. I'm just echoing what you said. We need to be talking about the things that are really a passion of ours, something that we truly love, because if catechesis is meant to be facilitating an encounter with Christ, we should be inviting them to encounter Christ through the ways that we encounter Christ, and knowing that that's going to be very different for each child. I mean, every kid is different. Fundamentally, every single human being is unique, and so it's interesting seeing where the overlaps are and where the kids are different. I mean, I'm sure as a mother of 5, you see this daily.
Yes, they are, I mean, they're different in what they need, but all of them need relationship.
Right.
Like they deeply need that relationship. And it's interesting that you go into talking about teaching and the teacher must be interested in their own topic. Otherwise, I mean, two pieces there. The teacher has to be interested in what they're saying. And so as we're in this time of Eucharistic revival, that is kind of one of the things that kind of keeps coming back to me,
Hmm.
because a question that's out there is like, well, how do we teach our children to love the Eucharist? And it's like, well, we must love the Eucharist. Like
Yeah.
that is how we are going to teach our children to love the Eucharist, is if we are practicing these things ourselves. So that's like the first place to go, is to be like, okay, well, how do I increase my devotion to the Eucharist? And then that second part, with the teacher taking that thing that they love and giving it to a child, like that relationship between either whether you're the educator or whether you're the parent giving it to the child, it's like learning takes place in the context of a relationship. And so that is, I think that that's something that's really important for like parents to remember, is that what our child learns about their faith is going to be in the context of my relationship with them. So it's not even, it's not about having like all of our ducks in a row necessarily. It's about like being just like completely committed to this relationship with this child and, what they need. So
Yeah, I mean, I think my sons learn the most from me when it comes to the faith by just seeing me at mass.
yes.
Like just that presence, the way
Mhm.
that I hold myself when I'm kneeling,
Mhm.
inviting them to do the same, genuflecting, saying prayers at the end of mass of Thanksgiving out loud with your family.
Mhm.
I mean, these are little things. Not everybody. If you're listening to this and you don't go to mass every Sunday and every holy day of obligation, like obviously start there.
Right.
Let's get the I call it the bare minimum, the precepts of the church,
Like the 6 precepts of the church.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
I
just the
actually
bare minimum. Let's get that.
just this week that became really important to me for some reason, because I was thinking about like the definition of what a Catholic is.
Hmm.
I was like, okay, like I think we need to get back to basics in terms of like what is our definition of a Catholic. And so to kind of go back to, I was like, okay, a Catholic is a person who received the gift of baptism within the Catholic Church. Like that is what a Catholic is. It's an identity
Mhm.
that's a gift. But like, what is it to be a practicing Catholic too? It's those 6 precepts. And that the first one is that you go to mass every single Sunday and on those holy days of obligation. And that is a very powerful witness to your children. Like
Mhm.
being taken to mass every single Sunday. Like this is what we do. Um, so much more than really than so many things that you could say to them about this being important, like is that action of going to mass every single Sunday.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Well, and then the rest is going to look different depending on the family situation. Like obviously, holding to the teachings of the church on faith and morals is non-negotiable.
Yeah, of course.
Um, the
Yeah.
precepts, the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, living the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So there's
Mhm.
a lot to it. But as far as like the individual life of the Catholic family, like I try to go to daily mass. It's very easy because we have daily mass in the chapel at my school because I teach at a Catholic school.
Yes.
And my son goes to a Catholic elementary school. And so they go to mass as a school on every Tuesday.
Mhm.
And that's huge to me.
Right.
Um, and of course, a lot of families homeschool and they're able to bring their kids to daily mass. So I'm not saying that every Catholic needs to go to daily mass. In fact, you can be a very good Catholic and not go to daily mass. but gosh, it's a whole lot easier to be a good Catholic if you go to Mass more than once a week.
Those graces, yes, those
It's the graces increase.
graces.
So, but
yeah.
it's going to look different for everybody.
Yes.
And gosh, Rome is not built in a day. I mean, this was something that was really big for me as my son started going to kindergarten, as I knew he was going to Mass with his school on Tuesday. I'm going to Mass the other days, but I wanted him to come with me occasionally. Mm-hmm. And so I started, the first time I said, do you want to go with me? And he said, not really. And I said, that's okay. That's fine. And I would keep asking him, like, no pressure, just, do you want to come? Well, one day he said yes. And I said, great, let's go.
Let's go to Mass.
And then he was stressed the whole time because he's like, are we going to get out of here in time for me to get to school?
Aww.
I'm like, good Lord, man. Yes, I'm in charge of that. Don't worry about it. But then I asked him again. He was like, not today. But then just a couple weeks ago, I said, do you want to go to Mass with me? And he said, yes. And I let him ring the bells. So he just like, this is fun. So anyway, long story short, this was a year and I've only gotten him to daily Mass with me 2 times. So, if you're listening and you're like, I need to form my child and I need to instill this habit, like, let it be. Take a breath. You're doing great.
Well, yes, I think that there is this element of trusting God and being receptive to the things that God puts on your heart to do with your family, without going into some kind of like overload marathon mode, because you really cannot do everything. Like, there are so many beautiful devotions. There are so many wonderful saints. There are so many great things that you could do, but you absolutely, you cannot do all of them. You cannot just, do every single thing. But I mean, I think that we can, as Catholic families, working together, the husband and wife in their own vocations together, being like, okay, like, what is it that we need to do to, grow as a Catholic family? Like, what are the things that we are going to do to, to grow in like this Catholic spirituality and show our children what we believe and teach them and those kinds of things. And I think it's beautiful that you offered your son this chance, and he will remember that. He will remember that. And that's great. Cool.
You mentioned that you and your husband were both converts.
Yes.
Relatively recently, within the last decades. What how did that come about?
Okay, so my husband and I we were dating and engaged when we were considering the question of, are we going to become Catholic? It was something that had been part of my husband's journey for a while. So when we started dating in our early 20s, he had probably been considering Catholicism for 5 years. His brother had become Catholic. His father had actually been baptized Catholic and was, on a very long journey of returning to the faith. But there was that brother who converted and then a sister who converted. My husband's part of a very large family. But it was one of these critical questions for, when we were choosing, like, are we going to make this life together? Are we going to become Catholic? And I grew up in evangelical, Protestantism, a really wonderful church, wonderful people, loved Jesus a lot, really cared for me really well. But what I felt was missing was just kind of the history, really. Like, it did kind of feel as though everything was kind of built on shaky ground for some reason. It was like, this isn't connected to, it just felt like it wasn't connected to anything. And often when it was church history time, we would talk about that first century and then skip about 1400 years and then get to the Reformation. And then, and for anyone who doesn't know, Reformation Day is actually often celebrated at Protestant churches. So like October 31st, the day that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. There are Protestant churches that like celebrate it. Like, it's in the pamphlet, like it's in the church bulletin, like, today is Reformation Day. hooray. And so like just kind of grew up with that understanding, but just kind of felt this disconnect. I was like, there's something here that's just not connected. And so when my husband, who at the time I was dating, said something about like he was really strongly considering joining the Catholic Church and that we should not continue doing whatever it was that we were doing unless I was also open to that idea. I was like, you know what? Yes, I'm interested in finding out more about Catholicism and seeing what this is. There was a lot, that didn't make sense at first, for sure. A lot. And one of the, like whatever was, this is funny now that I write about saints, because whatever was going on with the saints, I was like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, I don't know, like what you like I don't understand why you think that you can pray to these people. I don't know what that's about. Mary was that was a whole bridge to cross. And then it felt like just the understanding of grace was really different than what I had grown up with. And so all of these different kind of like bridges to cross. But in the end, it was interesting because we had all those questions and we had all these, discussions going on amongst ourselves. And then he and I went to a presentation about the Eucharist. And I have to tell you, this presentation was not super exciting. Like they did a fine job. They did a fine job, but it was, it was a PowerPoint and it wasn't like super engaging or anything like that. But both of us left that presentation. We were like, okay, like this is the peace. The Eucharist is the peace because this is what unites the Old Testament and the New Testament and the age that we're living in now. This is Jesus's promise to be with us always. This is the fulfillment of that promise. We want to be a part of this. We will do what we have to be a part of this. And we trust that the other questions are going to get answered along the way. And they really have been. And I'm so thankful to be Catholic. I'm so, it is good to be living out family life with the sacraments. Like I cannot imagine trying to do it in any other way. Like we desperately need those graces. Do you have any like questions about that in particular? Was that kind of clear?
Yeah, no, I used to, when I worked at a parish, I did RCIA for 7 years.
Yes.
And so I'm always really interested to hear people's conversion stories or reversions or whatever the case might be. I was baptized Anglican. My godfather's an Anglican priest, and my dad was an Anglican. My mom was a lapsed Catholic. So I've said this on the show before, but I became Catholic pretty much because the best school in the city I grew up in was a Catholic school, and you got a discount if you're part of the parish. Okay. And so my dad took Catholicism more seriously at that point. That's probably not the right way to put it. He was already thinking about it. He was very faithful. He was a really solid, like, call it high church Anglican. He just had some questions. Like you said, like the saints, Mary, they weren't as big of a deal as an Anglican. It was more like, what's going on with the... Actually, I don't even know what the specific questions he asked were, but I know he spent all day with a priest. He showed up early in the morning with him, ended up going to the hospital, doing sick calls with him, went to lunch with him. Like he was asking him questions all day. And then he came home and said, all right, I guess I'm going to become Catholic. And my mom, it was easy. She was a lapsed Catholic, so she just came back to the practice of the faith. Right. But it's so interesting kind of seeing how God calls every person to the fullness of the Christian faith, because he does. He calls all people in one way or another, whether implicitly or explicitly, as Vatican II puts it. So there's this introduction, this proposition that the Lord makes to each of us in his own way. But it's so interesting to see how people respond to that. Right. And for some people, it's like you say, you go to this presentation, it's dry, it's maybe a little bit more intellectual, but you're like, yes, that's it. That's the piece. Well, other people, gosh, it's like 30 years that they have to meander around. I guess my only question, you said that the understanding of grace was very different from your upbringing versus the Catholic Church's view. What do you mind going into that a bit more? Okay.
First of all, can you hear what's going on upstairs? And do I need to like stop it? Okay, sorry. You can.
The noise reduction on Riverside is awesome. So
Okay, that's really good
yeah.
because my son is playing sea shanties upstairs.
That's awesome.
So
Don't
good.
stop the sea shanties.
Okay, we will just let the sea shanties continue. Okay, so I'll just kind of like take you into the discussion that my husband and I were having about this. I mean, he wasn't my husband at the time, but now I'm like calling him that because
Sure.
but okay, so he had proposed the idea that a person could, through God's mercy, become perfect, like sanctity, essentially, like that a person through God's mercy could, like achieve these, like, not achieve is the wrong word. See, that was my misunderstanding of it. The great sanctity of the saints was dependent on God's mercy to make them more holy. Okay.
Yep.
What I had grown up with this understanding of grace was that people are irredeemable, that we are, so kind of like that Martin Luther's dung heap illustration. It's like we are refuse.
Was it as strong as like the John Calvin, like total depravity, like that far?
What's interesting about that is a lot of evangelical churches do kind of grow from that Calvinistic standpoint of like, we can do nothing. Like we are just so without like the grace of God, like we are just refuse, which is interesting because I think that is the Catholic understanding is that everything is done through God's grace, of course.
Yeah.
But the particular worth of the human person is kind of what's in question, I guess. The way that I've heard it explained since is that the Catholic view is kind of like the noble warrior wounded on the battlefield by sin versus the dung heap, like absolute trash. And so what Johnny was working through at the time about what grace is and what grace can do in us was kind of, I was so like, no, that's not possible, because I think there was this idea that we could not change. We could not actually grow. Really, all it is God's grace acting through us who like can do nothing, which I actually don't think is an accurate understanding of a lot of Protestant theology. But like, particularly what I grew up with, it sounded to me so prideful to think that we could, grow in sanctity to the point where, what we were doing was actually good.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fundamental question, because in my history class, we it's basically Western civilization, European history, 1500 to present day. So we cover Martin Luther, we cover John Calvin in detail, and there's also a very big difference, like especially for those who are listening who are Protestant. Like, I completely understand that there's a difference between Luther and Calvin's theology versus their followers. Yes. So that being said, the understanding of Calvin was this twisting of St. Augustine, where sort of this extension of predestination that went beyond what the Catholic Church holds. Because the Catholic Church does hold in predestination to the extent that God knows, he has foreknowledge about whether we will choose to persevere in grace or not. Double predestination is that God has willed in his perfect will that some people are damned and some people are saved, which just to me is reprehensible. I don't know how you can possibly square a good God with that. Nonetheless, setting that aside, this idea of total depravity, it really gets down to the effects of original sin and whether it's even possible to have justice restored within us.
Yes.
And the Catholic view is that we are inherently good, that we were created by God as good. Male and female, he created them, said they are very good, crown of creation. There's nothing else created after that. So the anthropology of the Catholic is We're inherently good, but we're marred by sin, like that idea of the noble warrior that's wounded. I hadn't heard that, but I think it's helpful. But I think what helped my students the most was emphasizing that the Catholic view is about relationship. It's not about what we're doing. It's about what God's doing. And then we respond in cooperation. So God gives us the grace. I mean, it's really all him, right? Like, we can't do anything without God's grace. We can't even exist without God's continued active existence, right? He wills our existence. Otherwise, we would cease to be, and it would be like we had never existed at all. So we rely on God every single moment for our very existence, but then also every single action that we do has its ultimate cause in God. So everything that we do is, even our sin, even our disordered actions, ultimately start with God, but we ruin it. We choose a lesser good when we should choose a greater good. We don't cooperate with grace. And that's when we sin. That's when we miss the mark and either sever or lessen our relationship with God. But really, that's fundamental to really understanding that idea of grace and justification, is that we're not saying that we're special.
Right.
In fact, we're inclined to sin. Original sin has really done a number on us. But through God's grace, through baptism, we're restored. Through confirmation, it's elevated. And through the Eucharist, it's constantly renewed and strengthened. And it's our cooperation with the grace that God is giving us that allows us to do anything meritorious.
Yes. And I think that word, merit, is one of the things that, as someone who is either considering coming into Catholicism, just a Protestant who might be interested in what Catholics believe, the word merit can be a real hang-up.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, no, for sure.
Yeah, it's the idea that it kind of brings in this idea, this misunderstanding that Catholics think that you can work for your own salvation, or that that you are working your way into heaven. But
which is so ironic, because when you read scripture, St. Paul says he works out his salvation in fear and trembling.
Yes.
What else do you mean by that? Like, we're saved by grace. We will be saved, and God is calling us to salvation. Like, there's multiple steps here.
Right. And his grace is with us in every single one of those steps. But I mean, I think that there is kind of this amazing thing about Catholic theology, that it's like this idea that we could actually change, that God's grace is so good that we could actually be different because of it.
And what does that difference look like? Right? I mean, it's relationship. It's reflecting Jesus.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not like Will or Meredith become more. It's ironic, because in becoming more like Christ and putting ourselves second to the will of God, we actually become more who we were created to be.
Well, and yes, we are coming back to what we were already, and what we will be again through his grace again when we are in our perfected bodies.
Whatever that'll look like.
Whatever that's going to look like, we don't know. That's going to be exciting. So
I'm 5'4", so I'm hoping to be at least 5'8". That's,
oh my goodness!
Just a little bit. That'd be good. Very unimportant. I don't care how tall I am if I'm beholding God as he is.
Desire for height will be answered by whatever there is in heaven.
Beautiful. In sacred scripture, it says we lay up treasure for ourselves in heaven. So when it comes to like merit, I'm not sure what else to make of that. But then, I mean, the Catholic view, I think, when we properly understand it, makes so much sense. And it's all scriptural. It's not like we're trying to read into scripture a certain theology. It's just taking all of the data points and fleshing them out over the last 2,000 years. Like, we trust the saints, we trust the fathers of the church, we trust the councils. And there's it makes sense when you look at like St. Paul saying, I make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. That doesn't make any sense unless what's lacking is simply our cooperation.
Yes.
I mean, that's the only thing we can offer.
Right. Our relationship.
Right.
Our acceptance of the gift of our childhood to God the Father. And I think that is what he wants from us. And that is so beautiful. And that is what we see in this gift of the Eucharist, is he, is just this willingness to do anything to have a relationship with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's going to the furthest lengths and then some.
Yes. An extravagant, just outpouring of like self forever.
Mm-hmm.
So
I yesterday or 2 days ago, I was at the ordination mass for the Diocese of Phoenix here, and it was just so beautiful seeing these men lay down their lives for the church and to be changed in the way that they are. But there was a real pronounced motif, understanding that it's all about the Eucharist. I mean, Bishop Dolan made that very clear in his homily, and it's obviously very clear in the rite itself. But it caused me to, I mean, I believe in the Eucharist with all my heart. And when I was 7, I remember distinctly learning about it in class because I went to Catholic school, and they said, Jesus changes this bread and wine into his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And I remember as a 7-year-old, more or less, saying, yes, why not? That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's that childlike faith, right? Yeah. And I, since then, I mean, I'm working on a doctorate in liturgical theology at the moment. So like, I really love the Eucharist and I love the Mass and I love all this. But for some reason that ordination Mass during the consecration, I was just like glued in like a tractor beam, like, wow, Jesus is coming present right there. That doesn't make any sense. Right. And it wasn't that I didn't believe, it was that I just couldn't fathom the lengths that God is going to show us how much he loves us and desires to be part of us, to come into not only our bodies, but into our souls in a very pronounced way. So it really is tremendous, the gift of the Eucharist. And to bring it back to your book, it's really tremendous that we have a way to share that faith with our children.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
It is.
It's a beautiful gift. Not often do I find myself speechless, but sometimes when I'm thinking about the Eucharist, I either want to talk for hours about how awesome it is, or I'm just dumbstruck and like, wow.
It is. And it is a very great mystery too.
Yeah.
And so I think that engaging with it, like the different, of course, at Mass, and then the stories that we hear about it and theology as well, those kinds of things. I mean, those are all wonderful, but to know also that some of it really is a mystery. And like, we will continue to grow in our love for the Eucharist, but like also just to kind of be like, sometimes the only response is adoration, is just like, this is amazing and thank you. That's all I can do. So
right. Well, and when we get to heaven, the Eucharist as such will no longer be necessary because we'll see Jesus, right, and we'll see God face to face in the beatific vision, God willing. So it's a tremendous gift along the way, right? This food for the journey, medicine for immortality, where we're brought into these sacred realities in a foretaste and sort of as a anticipatory sense. Mm-hmm. Because I always like to remind my students of this in sacraments class. It's like, where is Jesus? And then we have this great conversation about where Jesus is. And I say, okay, that's great, but where is Jesus? And then finally they say, in heaven. I'm like, right. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. He's in heaven. So what is the Eucharist? Also Jesus, but not in the same way. I'm like, yeah, good enough. That's like, yeah. How so fun. It's like mind numbing. Because I mean, any other instance, we say this is a thing. It has a particular substance and essence, And then we bring someone the Eucharist and we say, yeah, it looks like bread and wine, but the substance is actually something completely different. It doesn't quite make sense with our heads. But when we look at the whole, and I love the way, when you were talking about your conversion, I love the way you said the Eucharist ties together the Old Testament, New Testament, and our present age, the age of the church, because it does, and it shows us that unity. But it's exactly that, I think, that helped me when I was grappling with a lot of these things intellectually as a high schooler. It was that unity, that history, that really confirmed for me that the Catholic faith is true and the Eucharist is Jesus. Is that despite what my feeble senses see, and the fact that they fail, this is Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity. And how do I know that? Well, the testimony of the church is abundantly clear in showing that continuity. Like, for example, in Hebrew, the city where Jesus was born, Bethlehem, means city of bread. And in Aramaic, it's city of flesh. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Why linguistically would that happen? And it's not like Jesus can say, oh, I was born in the wrong city, gotta go be born again in Bethlehem. Like, everybody knows where he was born. So that's not a proof of the Eucharist, but it's still just like,
well, it's just these, like, the reality shows us what, there are these beautiful echoes of truth in like these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, reality is what it is. And there's a lot of things that confirm reality. I mean, scientific inquiry, we can look and observe the natural world and determine things about it. And I think people have forgotten that theology is a science. It is the queen of the sciences. Mm-hmm. There's a rational way of exploration through theology and philosophy. We seem to have thought that theology is just, well, I mean, atheistic materialists will just say, well, it's just made up nonsense.
Right.
But if you're in tune to the reality that there's more than just the material world, that the natural world and the supernatural world exist alongside one another, mm-hmm. that there are things that we cannot see, we cannot measure. No one's ever going to be able to say exactly what the soul looks like or how much it weighs, because that would be the wrong metric.
Question. Right? We have like the angels on the head of a pin question.
Right. Yeah. Like, it doesn't make any sense. That's nonsense.
You're using the wrong words here.
Like, where is an angel? Wherever they're active. That's how St. Thomas says it. So it's like, yeah, I mean, there is a reality that can be discovered if we're open to all of the sources.
Yeah.
Namely faith, reason, and science.
Right.
That we hold all of these things together. And that's another thing I love about being Catholic, is that we don't have to throw away good scientific inquiry or good philosophy in order to engage in theology and the things of religion, because they are all from the same source. They're from God. And if they're done properly and with the right presuppositions. So, I mean, that's why Catholics, like you said, hospitals, universities, all of these wonderful Catholic inventions.
Yes.
It's a beautiful thing to be Catholic and to pass on the faith. And I'm thankful for people like you who are creating these great resources. And I guess that's the last question I really had for you was, how did you come about writing this book? I mean, do you know people at Tan Books and they said, you should do this?
It was created in partnership with Tan. Okay. So they were looking for something that they could offer to families during the time of Eucharistic revival. It's like, okay, how can families participate in this together? And I'd already written a devotional about saints for children that was for a different publishing house. It was actually a devotional that was geared toward Catholic or Protestant. It's an interesting little book for many of those reasons, but I had already done some saint writing about children. And so Tan approached me and asked if I would be willing to do one about saints who loved the Eucharist. And so we worked together to create the list of which saints that it would be. And what was so funny was you can't just make a list of 20 saints who love the Eucharist. because loving the Eucharist is just this very central part to being a saint.
Right.
So like all of the saints love the Eucharist. There are thousands of saints who loved the Eucharist. But we narrowed it down to 20 and we're like, okay, these 20, let's tell the story of these 20 saints. And so then I got into looking up their stories and just finding different moments in each of their lives that I could focus on and kind of draw out a story that talked about, at least approached their Eucharistic spirituality. And we wanted to include some younger, so there's children, there's several children in there. There's some popes in there. There's religious sisters in there as well. And so wanted to get kind of like a broad look at the fact that love for the Eucharist is this central part of being a Catholic. And as people who are hoping, through God's grace to become saints ourselves, that we can be encouraged to increase our own devotion to the Eucharist too.
Beautiful. And that is it's a very clear call. I completely echo it and agree with you that it's got to start there. We have to love Christ. We have to love the Eucharist. And from that, others will see that. Our children will see that. Our friends will see that. And by God's grace, they will grow in their devotion as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Witness is one of the most vital things to the Christian life because we're not saved by ourselves. We're not saved alone. We're made to be in community.
Yes.
We need one another.
Absolutely.
And we're either moving towards sanctity or away from sanctity. There's no middle ground. Like St. Ignatius of Loyola puts it, you're either in Jesus' army or Satan's army. Make a choice.
Wow.
There is no non-choice.
Right.
And so when it comes to the Eucharist, it's like, do we ever reach that threshold where we say, all right, well, that's enough. That's enough love, I think. No, obviously. So we have to continually grow. There is no stagnation in the spiritual life.
Yes.
We're either moving forward or moving backwards. I should say we're either moving forward or we're falling headlong backwards or rolling down a hill dramatically to our
and I think
death.
that, having really very dramatically, yes. So having the Eucharist, having something even as simple as it sounds, having something so external to ourselves to look at can help us, continue forward. I guess I'm thinking about adoration where you're looking up at the monstrance. It's like, this is a way, this is a way to move toward Jesus, like to go and to be at adoration and to be like looking up at him. And even if you don't have anything particularly profound to say, or if you feel like, like you're not really even hearing anything back, it's like to be there, to like physically be kneeling and like looking up at something, I think that is a way to move forward. That's a way to move toward him.
Amen. And as St. John Vianney says, you don't have to do anything either. You just look at him and he'll look back at you.
Yes.
And so it can be very simple. Well, I encourage everyone, especially with those with children, to go and get Eucharistic Saints, 20 Stories of Devotion to Jesus from 10 Books by Meredith Hinds. And if you don't have kids, buy a copy anyway and give it to somebody, because everybody knows somebody with kids.
Everybody knows somebody with kids, and everybody actually knows someone who's Catholic for the most part. So
that's right.
Go for it. Yeah.
Statistically speaking, you should buy at least 10 copies.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Eucharistic Saints, 20 Stories of Devotion to Jesus from 10 Books. Meredith, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for being with me, and thanks for the great conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Will. It was great to be with you.